Dr. Chrysovalantis Kyriacou received his PhD from Royal Holloway University in London. He is a lecturer in ecclesiastical history at the Theological School of the Church of Cyprus. He's also taught at the University of Cyprus, European University of Cyprus, and Royal Holloway University of London. Dr. Kyriacou has authored a number of books, including Orthodox Cyprus under the Latins, 1191 to 1571, Society, Spirituality, and Identities, and the Byzantine warrior hero, Cypriot folk songs as history and myth. But for today, he's here with us to talk about a little known event in Cypriot history known as the Cypriot Peasant Revolt. Chrysovalanti, thank you again for accepting my invitation.
Andrea, thank you so much for inviting me.
So many might not know, especially those living outside of Cyprus, that as of January 2021, May 12th has been deemed Farmers' Day, which coincides with the anniversary of King Alexis's execution. And actually, your paper, The Cypriot Peasant Revolt, states that on May 1427, one day only, and for that day only, Cyprus had two kings. And this is sort of what really piqued my interest when I came across your paper. Very, very fascinating event in Cypriot history. But before we dive into that, I like to kind of get a sense of the background for the period. And so I just thought maybe we can start by opening up with what you can tell us about the socio-political structure and makeup of Cyprus at that time. What sort of ethnic and religious groups existed, economic structure. Can you just give us an overview of what Cyprus is like?
Okay, let us set the scene. Medieval Cyprus was, at the time of the Cypriot Peasant Revolt, it was a former Byzantine province, which means that it was once ruled by the Christian emperors, the Christian Roman emperors in Constantinople. But this ended in 1191 when Cyprus was conquered by Richard the Lionheart, King of England, during the Third Crusade. So Cyprus later passed to the Knights Templar, back to Richard, and Richard sold Cyprus to the Frankish kings of Jerusalem, the Lusignan family. Jerusalem was conquered by the Muslims, by Saladin, and the Lusignans needed a place to go. They needed a new kingdom, a new home. So from the late 12th century and for the centuries to come until the Venetians took over Cyprus in the late 15th century, Cyprus was ruled by the House of Lusignan, a family that was they originated from southern France. Cyprus became probably the most important Crusader kingdom in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was the kingdom of Jerusalem and Cyprus, and in the late 15th century, it was incorporated into the Venetian Maritime Empire until 1570, 1571, when it was conquered by the Ottomans. So at the time of the Peasant Revolt, the early 15th century, Cyprus was a Lusignan kingdom. It was ruled by a Lusignan king. On the eve of the Peasant Revolt, this Lusignan king was Janus of Lusignan. We have a ruling elite that is mainly Western European in origin, although many of these Western Europeans were actually born in Cyprus, and they understood and they spoke Greek as well, but they also spoke French and Latin. So Lusignan Cyprus was really a multi-ethnic island in the sense that it was inhabited not only by Franks, Western Europeans, and Greeks, or to be more precise, Greek-speaking Orthodox who identified themselves as Romai, as Eastern Romans. And here there is a connection with Byzantium, with the Empire of Constantinople, cultural as well as religious connection. But we also have Syrians, we have Copts, we have Armenians, We have Maronites, namely Oriental Christian groups inhabiting the island at the time. So this is the general picture in terms of society and ethnic groups. So the main characteristic of the social structure of Cyprus at the time was the feudal system, which means that we have large estates cultivated by peasant by by Cypriot peasants. The Cypriot peasants were the majority of the population. Their number is estimated around 80 to 85% of the overall population of Cyprus. So they were really the majority. Most of these peasants were Romei, that is Greek-speaking Orthodox, and the major group among the peasants were the serfs, as elsewhere in the medieval world. So the serfs were peasants who were attached to their land. They could not leave without permission of their master. They actually belonged to their lords. They had restricted rights, and they offered unpaid corvée labor for a number of days per year. So their life, they lived a really hard life.
You talk about using a bottom-up approach to researching this event in Cypriot history. So, what is it that you actually are setting out to do with reinterpreting these series of events that would, culminate in the Peasant Revolt?
Well, Andrea, all sources on the revolt come from the pen of the socially privileged, namely authors who were hostile to the peasantry and they were hostile to social disorder. The thing with modern historians is that there is a tendency to simply copy what their sources say, which, in my view, calls for a more critical engagement with these materials. So, for example, we know that the peasants were desperate, but we rarely try to recover their voice and understand more deeply their perspective of the events.
Leon Dios Majeras, his work is one of our principal sources for the period. Speaking of the sources, and there are other Italian sources, those of Amari, Bustron, Sturmbali. Now, they're all in agreement with each other, and I quote here, that peasants rose up against their masters, killing and plundering, and that they were, quote again, thieves, adventurers, brigands, without any discipline or political motivation, end quote. Before we understand sort of the socioeconomic motivations that would culminate in the peasant revolt, can you briefly recount their version of events that culminated in the execution of the so-called King Alexis? What sort of unfolds as we understand it according to those predominant narratives?
Well, we have everything begins with the Mamluk invasion of Cyprus in 1426. So the Mamluks were a warrior slave dynasty established in medieval Egypt, and they invaded Cyprus to punish the losing king Janus for piratical activities in Syria and the slave trade of Muslim captives. So the Mamluks invade. In July 1426, there is a fierce battle in Hyrokitia between the Lusignan army and the Mamluk invaders. The Mamluks defeat the Lusignan army and they capture King Janus. They later sack the capital, Nicosia. They withdraw, and as soon as they withdraw from Cyprus, taking slaves and the Lusignan king as a trophy with them, there is a peasant uprising, which seems to have begun in Nicosia. So all these sources agree that the peasants took up arms, they plundered the storehouses of the rich, killed, they raped. So we have social disorder, acts of violence, but the same sources, they are also in agreement that the peasants were organized. This was an organized, or at least semi-organized revolt, and this is a point to which we need to return later on. So we have a peasant army organized in different administrative peripheries under a king, a peasant king named Alexis, and you have the attempt to restore order. The Latin archbishop, who was also the king's brother, Hugh of Lusignan, was the regent in the absence of Janus. Hugh, with his closest collaborators and hospitallers, they crush the revolt. Petros Macheras, Leontios' brother, is involved in the suppression of the revolt. So this is an interesting detail because it shows that Leontios himself was involved in the whole situation. So his narrative is not and should not be regarded as 100% objective. And finally, Alexis, peasant king, was captured, and he was executed on the very day that Janus returned from captivity Cyprus. And this is the whole story of the peasant revolt.
Now, you mentioned the connection that the Mahiras family had with the Battle of Hirokitia. How are their version of events shaped by their position and privilege?
Well, the whole Mahiras family is highly involved in Lusignan administration. Mahiras' brothers fight with the Lusignans against against the Genoese. Leontios' father had been counselor to the former king. Leontios was a diplomat in Lusignan service, and we know that during the Battle of Hirokitia, he was actually responsible for distributing wine to the army. So his interests, but also his viewpoint, his ideology, was closely related to the fate of the Lusignan crown. Mahiras, as many other Cypriots in his day, saw Frankish king as the cornerstone of social order. The king in medieval societies was chosen by God. So Mahiras perceived the peasant uprising as a violation of both royal and divine law. And of course, we have Mahiras' brother Petros, who participated in the suppression of the revolt. He was responsible for the trials of the arrested peasants and their execution. So yes, Mahiras' narrative sees the peasants in a very negative light.
Would it be unfair, or would it be apt to say that he's clearly pro-Latin?
Well, like all historical actors, Mahiras was a man of many identities. So he was proud of his Byzantine Orthodox heritage, but he was also loyal to his Frankish masters because his family's social status depended on it. But the thing with Mahiras is that he was also a realist. He considered the Lusignan king as a divinely chosen ruler who guaranteed order and prosperity in a period when Cyprus was surrounded by enemies, and these enemies were the Genoese and the Muslims.
You know, I mentioned those other sources. I talked about the Amari Chronicle, Florio Bustron, Strambali. Is Mahiras's chronicle the oldest that we have, the oldest written evidence that we have of this peasant uprising? In other words, do the other chronicles add anything to what we know about it, or are they just sort of regurgitating what Mahiras wrote in his recital?
Yes, Mahiras is a contemporary source. He's an official in Lusignan service. His brother participates in suppressing the revolt. But we also have another contemporary source, a brief note by an anonymous Greek judge in Nicosia, another official in Lusignan service who hates disorder, and he's hostile against the peasants. And all other sources, more or less later, we have Strambali, late 16th or early 17th translator of Macheras in Italian. He was probably a Latin noble from Cyprus, and he basically translates Macheras' Greek text into Italian without adding anything else. We have Amati, perhaps a mid-15th century or late 15th century chronicle, and Florio Bustron, probably coming from the pen of nobles. Bustron writes in the 1560s, so more than a century after the revolt. And Amati and Bustron add details in their narrative that cannot be found in Macheras, such as they mentioned that the peasants used crossbows. This is important, a minor detail, but an important one, because to use a crossbow requires special skills and special training. And this, in my view, supports the argument that the peasants were organized or semi-organized as an army. For later historians, the revolt never appears in their writings. We have Stephen of Lusignan, who was a Dominican, vicar of the Bishop of Limassol, writing after 1571, in expectation of Catholic help to recover Cyprus. And Lusignan completely omits the event, in a way polishing unpleasant historical memories of peasant disobedience, exactly because he wished to present a rather idealized picture of his native island and to draw Catholic powers to liberate Cyprus from the Ottomans. So the main characteristic of all these narratives is that they all hated the peasants being insubordinate and threatening the privileges of the elite.
I recall reading that in Macheras' work, he's incredibly critical of the Genoese, who in the 14th century. So this is we're going back in time a little bit here. They conquered Famagusta, and they added a salt tax and a 10% tax on landed property, a heavy annual tax and compensation. And he actually writes that the peasants were tormented by war, taxation, and catastrophic locust raids, in addition to plague. Could we say that the events that would culminate in the revolt were rooted in these tumultuous years? Is Macheras trying to suggest that in any way?
I think that Macheras paints the bleak picture of the decades preceding the revolt, not necessarily justifying the actions of the peasants or explaining why the revolt took place, but a critical reading of Macheras will point out that exactly these circumstances led the peasantry in despair and made the peasants angry. Well, we have the Genoese, an Italian maritime power involved in Cypriot dynastic politics after the assassination of King Peter I. And the Genoese were hated by the Cypriots as foreign invaders. They eventually captured Famagusta, the main port of Cyprus, and kept Famagusta for almost a century. So the loss of Famagusta was the beginning of a new crisis for the Lusignan kingdom. The Lusignans were humiliated by the Genoese. The loss of Famagusta meant a loss of income, and they tried to recover by imposing new taxes over the population. And these included the salt tax, an additional 10% tax on landed property, and a heavy annual tax and compensation to the Genoese. So the peasants, especially the serfs were trying to buy their freedom, to become free men and women. But because of the taxes, they could not do so. So when the Mamluks came and they captured King Janus, there was fear of a new taxation that will be imposed over the peasantry. And in fact, a new tax was imposed because the nobles had to find the money to pay the ransom for the king's liberation. So this was in a way the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, the taxes and the fear for new taxes led the peasants to this radical action against the lords.
How would you characterize the differences between the peasantry in the Byzantine period versus the Frankish period? Because I'm trying to wrap my head around what it's clearly rooted in these socioeconomic differences. And you note that Peter Edbury concluded that there was no particular reason to suppose that the peasantry found their Frankish lords harsher masters than their Greek predecessors. But on the other hand, Nikos Sforonos says that 1191 aggravated the legal and social status of Cypriot serfs. So, how did they kind of navigate their existence? Like, was one worse than the other? How can we better understand this period in terms of serfdom?
Well, this is a highly complex and highly debatable issue. As you've mentioned, some scholars consider that the Franks simply adopted earlier Byzantine customs concerning the peasantry and the legal status of peasants, which might as well be the case. Others argue that the Byzantine system was less demanding in the sense of permitting serf mobility and less corvée days, so less days of unpaid labor. I think that the important factor to take into consideration is that the social inequality between rich and poor after 1191, which very much existed before the Crusader conquest of Cyprus, was broadened because of the cultural and religious differences between the dominant elite, which was a Latin Rite class, and the lower masses, who were Orthodox Romei, Orthodox Greeks. So it's not just a matter of comparing two legal systems. The essential question, the essence of the matter, is not only the legal status of the peasants, but also the cultural background of the peasants and their masters. And this made a difference comparing to the earlier period.
How would you characterize Orthodox Catholic relations throughout this period? Like, I think most people listening would assume that they were very stressed, but did that sort of ebb and flow? Did that change as the decades moved on?
Yes, I mean the Orthodox were forced to submit to the Latins in 1260, although they maintained their bishops and liturgical traditions, and centuries to come, up until 1571, tension fluctuated. So when Latin bishops or papal representatives attempted to Latinize the Orthodox, to impose the Latin doctrines and liturgical customs, there was popular tension, and we have riots. This happened, for example, in 1360 when the rebels, the people of Nicosia, besieged the Latin cathedral of St. Sophia in Nicosia. So, what happened with the Orthodox? The Orthodox generally maintained their doctrines and customs, but they did so without provoking the Latins and even acknowledging the realistic need for everyday interaction with their masters. But as we move closer to the events of the revolt, the situation becomes more complicated because in 1406 and 1412, during a period of rising anti-Latinism in Constantinople, the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Patriarchate of Constantinople, declared the Cypriots schismatics for remaining under Latin ecclesiastical control. So the failure of Cypriot bishops to prevent the schism with Constantinople might have contributed, and this is part of my argument concerning the dynamics of tension within the Orthodox community of Cyprus. So the Cypriot bishops failed to prevent the schism with Constantinople, and this might have contributed in the general dissatisfaction of their flock, thus causing disobedience and ultimately revolt against the upper classes.
You wrote quite a bit on heroic folk songs that expresses certain themes and motifs. Are the folk songs, the Cypriot folk songs that many are familiar with, like the Yanis, wrestling, charos, are these rooted in this period? I'm just curious.
Well, this is this is part of my argument on concerning peasant agency, namely peasant attempts to shape their own lives and to resist their masters. Well, these songs were recorded in the late 19th and 20th centuries. So the language changes, the language is not medieval, but we have specific themes and motives. So
Do you mind sharing for listeners who might not be familiar with these? What are some of these folk songs? Who is the Yanis in these stories, and what sort of symbols do they represent?
Well, these songs basically talk about warrior heroes. Okay, and these warrior heroes have Byzantine names. The Yanis, perhaps the most popular of these heroes, he has he's of mixed race, if you like. In Cyprus, he's half Jewish, half Greek. In other places, he is half Arab, half Greek. So the Yanis is a giant warrior, and he fights with Haros, the angel of death, sent by God to kill him. Haros cannot defeat him. They wrestle, and Haros eventually prevails using treachery and God's help. Finally, Diogenes dies, but he is the moral victor, and God and Haros are presented rather negatively. So these songs were, as I said before, they were recorded in the late 19th and 20th centuries. So the language is not medieval, but certain narrative elements, certain themes and motifs go back to the Middle Ages, especially the late medieval period. And this is of interest because the Peasant Revolt takes place in the late medieval period. I don't want to connect directly the Cypriot Peasant Revolt to the songs. What I argue is that the songs reflect the viewpoints, the perceptions, the anxieties, and the agency of the social group participating in such revolts. So a key theme repeated in Cypriot heroic folk songs is the injustice theme. Namely, you have a low-level hero fighting the injustice of the king and his nobility, and this seems to fit within the crisis of the late medieval period. And Haros here is represented as an enemy warrior or a pirate whom the hero to fight. So in medieval societies, the socially accepted way of viewing injustice, viewing the tragedies of life is theodicy. So God punishes people for their sins, and unless people repent, they continue to be punished. Here, you have a radically different perception of suffering um, in human life. People are not responsible for their own suffering. God is responsible. God, in a way, God and royal authority are tyrannically, um, and this is this is heretical, tyrannically
Mhm.
imposing pain over the lives of people. So what humans can do is to fight back, to resist against this extreme injustice.
Taking into consideration, the dynamics created by the pressure of hunger, poverty, and desperation, you write that the chronicles are simply one version of the revolt story, a radical, direct, and violent way through revolt and resistance to oppression. So the $64,000 question is, what do you think best explains these series of events, and what unfolds really that led to this, to the execution of King Alexis? And we'll get to King Alexis in a second.
So what really surprised me when I studied sources on the revolt is that the major peasant revolts in Western Europe in this period, for example, the Jacquerie in France or the 1381 peasant revolt in England, um, they were they were organized by the peasants themselves. The peasants were able to coordinate their actions and to set up an army to fight the nobility. And the Cypriot peasant revolt is no exception. But I think that the real question is not what actually happened, because all sources agree in terms of the events. The real question is one of understanding the nature of the revolt, considered as an important act of brigandage by some scholars. So I think that what the chronicles show is that although they all authors hate the peasants, they really hate them, but they all all chronicles agree that uh, this was ultimately a political act because it generated a peasant king. And this king was not a self proclaimed king, but one chosen. He was chosen by the rebels themselves. And this, for me, is important because it stresses popular agency. The peasants were not passive historical actors, but wished and did try to resist oppression.
Who was Alexis? Do we know anything about him, and how he was chosen as the peasant king?
Well, we know very little about Alexis. We know that he was a peasant from the village of Katomia. Maheras mentions that he was royal Agelarchis, namely a messenger or a cavalry official. And what we know is that all peasants submitted to his command. So we lack the specific details of his election, but assume that there was a kind of assembly in which local peasant communities in the revolt participated, and they chose Alexis as their leader, perhaps because Alexis was a charismatic man and he was also involved in royal administration, or he was in the army. So he had knowledge that was necessary to fight back, to fight their lords.
You mentioned that he was in the army, and earlier you said that the sources talk about how the peasants were using crossbows. Who would have trained these peasants? Is it fair to say that he had a hand in that? And if not, do you have any guesses as to how the peasants would have been organized?
Well, to be honest, I have no idea about the crossbow thing. Perhaps the peasants using the crossbow were part of the Lusignan army. They were probably part of the Lusignan army. But what Maheras and the other sources say is that the peasants were organized under captains. These captains ruled specific areas, specific districts, and we also find captains in the Jacquerie Revolt in France. So these these units, these peasant units under the captains were carrying various weapons. You mentioned crossbows, which demanded specific skills and training to be used, and they also used spears and clubs. So you don't have a spontaneous peasant uprising. You have an attempt to to form an army, and an army capable of resisting the knights
Mhm.
of the lords.
Now, Alexis, eventually he's captured and he's executed. Do we know, or could you rather tell us about what series of events would lead to his capture and execution? I believe there was an event, a massacre near a river. Do we know how he was executed?
Well, this massacre took place in 1192. The people of Nicosia took up arms against the Knights Templar, but the Templars crushed the revolt, and the banks of the River Pedieos were filled with blood, and peasants put there a memorial stone, which was called Stone of Freedom, Lithos Eleftherias. And this reference comes from Maheras, who tells us about this event in his chronicle in the 15th century, probably soon after the crushing of the suppression of the peasant uprising under Alexis. So there seems to be a connection in Maheras's mind between the two revolts. And what I have suggested is that perhaps one of the demands of the peasants was eleftheria, liberty, in the sense of liberty, social liberty, liberty from their masters and the taxes they had to pay. So yes, Alexis was captured, as were many peasants participating in the revolt, and he was led to the gallows in 12 May 1427, almost a year after the peasant revolt began.
It's really interesting because you write. I mean, if someone listening to this, they're going to imagine this as an expression of class consciousness, but you caution against that. You don't say that this is necessarily a national liberation movement or an expression of fully developed class consciousness. Is this strictly anti-Latin, anti-Catholic? Is it just an expression of, as you said just now, a desire to better their status, as serfs that are locked to the land? Can you kind of just elaborate a little bit on that? Why is this not an expression of class consciousness?
Well, historians like labels. They like putting things into boxes. We historians use categories to understand past people in societies, but in the Middle Ages, it is usually impossible to separate religion from politics and society. So rather than seeing the revolt as a purely class or purely ethnic or national conflict, as historians had done in the past and more recently, I propose that we should see the peasants and their masters as living human beings with many identities. So, on the one hand, the lords, the Frankish lords, are the elite. They exploit those below them, and they speak French, Latin, or Greek. They dress differently. Their faith is that of Rome. On the other hand, the rebels, or most of the rebels, are serfs, most of whom speak Greek. They are oppressed, they are dressed differently, and their faith is that of Constantinople. And here you have several identities in conflict. So, in terms of what was the aim of the revolt, I cannot give a definite answer. I argue that it was probably political change. You have a new king, peasant king, who will not impose, who is expected that he will not impose new taxes and perhaps liberate the serfs. And you have the reception of this important event in historiography, conflicting interpretations. You have colonial and neo-colonial scholarship, which tends to interpret this event as as an unimportant series of plundering and killing, and this is basically the picture coming from chronicles. And for me, the problem with this interpretation is that it implies a hostility against the vast majority of the population. You have the Orthodox serfs being oppressed by a Western dominant class, and this indirectly legitimizes Western Crusader domination on the island, and later, in the mid 20th century, British colonialism. So, for anti colonial nationalists, this was a national revolution, and I think it's clear that it was not. And this is anachronistic to argue that it was a national revolution, like the Greek War of Independence in 1821, is simply anachronistic and wrong. For Marx historians, this was a class struggle. I have a problem with this interpretation because you cannot speak of a fully developed class consciousness in the Middle Ages. I don't know if there is a fully developed class consciousness even today, to be honest. So, my interpretation is that the nature of the revolt was political, encompassing social, religious, and ethnic motivations. So, the peasants participate in the historical narrative. They are not muted. They have a voice, their own voice, and this voice demands the improvement of their daily life and does so by force. They use force to change their lives. There was no other way for them. And this is why they are labeled as thieves and corsairs and brigands.
I want to come full circle here because at the start of this recording, I had mentioned that May 12th is Farmer's Day, or the Day of the Farmer in Cyprus. Just your own personal opinion here. What do you think explains that choice to associate the Day of the Farmer specifically with the day of King Alexis's execution? What sort of lines or parallels are we implicitly drawing here?
The May 12th day was chosen because of political pressure from the broader left, and this is understandable because people need symbols, and the Peasant Revolt and the Peasant King, King Alexis, they're such strong symbols because of the unique circumstances in which Cyprus was found at the time. This was the only moment in Cypriot history when the peasantry expressed their presence and demanded to be considered as equally important historical actors as the elite. So you have the majority of the population who are not just harvesting the land and paying taxes, but they demand to participate in governing their own lives through their representative peasant king. So this, I believe, is the main reason why the broader left sees Alexis and his peasants as symbols of a proto-communist, if you like, which is anachronistic from a historical perspective, but understandable in the political discourse.
Really, really fascinating stuff, Chrysovalantis. This was fantastic. I'm really thankful that you accepted my invitation for this episode because I, like many listeners, presumably, have never heard of the Cypriot Peasant Revolt and the crowning of a second king. And it was really, really fascinating to have a better understanding and better insight into the medieval period. So, Chrysovalantis, thank you so much for your time and expertise.
Thank you. Exactly. This is, in a way, an unknown page of Cypriot history.